Little Brother, Chapter 11, The Billingsley Hospital. Mid-morning, March 15th, 1781. The Billingsleys, like most of the other families in Guilford Courthouse, stood stoically on their front porch. Some were brave enough to stand out on their lawns. The people of the village stared toward the north, in the direction of the freshly plowed fields just outside the town limits. No one spoke. They were entirely too mesmerized to speak. Thousands of British troops marched across the field in perfect formation. Hundreds of green and red clad soldiers on horseback rode on both sides of the immense army of foot soldiers. It was an impressive, frightening sight. "Where are they going?" asked Anna, and her tiny voice trembled with fright. She hugged her tiny rag doll close to her chest. "They are going off to some battlefield," Mrs. Billingsley reassured her. "They have no interest in us. They are here to fight the Continental Army." "Mother is right, Anna." Basil placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They are moving west of town. The Continental Army and our North Carolina militia have been encamped on our farm to the southwest. They must have left during the night, and the British are pursuing them." "But will there be a battle close by?" the tiny girl responded, lip trembling. Basil smiled and shook his head. "I do not believe so. They will probably travel several miles to the west. There is more open ground near New Market." His confident words had just departed his lips when a thunderous roar of cannon fire erupted to the northwest, just beyond the borders of town. The concussion of the guns made the ground tremble and rattled the glass in the windows of their home. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse had begun. Elizabeth Billingsley shot a concerned look at her son. "That was close, Basil." Her son frowned. "I may have been mistaken." Another loud barrage of cannon fire rocked the town. It shook the ground so hard that the dust in the street danced upward in tiny clouds and hovered above the ground. Moments later, a dozen British dragoons broke away from the immense army and rode into town. The men dispersed and approached the homes along the street. Some of the nearby residents turned to flee to the safety of their houses. One of the horse soldiers shouted, "We mean you no harm. Please, wait just a moment. We have an announcement for the entire village." The frightened citizens stopped and stared at the soldiers. The officer in charge moved to a position in the center of the street, right in front of the Billingsley house. The man cleared his voice and declared, "His Excellency General Lord Cornwallis ordered us to visit this town to warn the citizens to stay inside their homes for the remainder of the day. There is to be a battle no more than a mile to the west of here. For your safety, please do not venture in the direction of the gunfire." He nodded. "That is all. You may return to your indoor activities." The man turned and faced the Billingsley home. He urged his horse to take a few steps in the direction of the front porch. He tipped his hat to Elizabeth. "Madame, I am Captain Blake Hollingsworth of His Majesty's British Legion. I am pleased to make your acquaintance." He locked eyes with the young and beautiful Martha Billingsley. He smiled broadly and tipped his hat again. "Young lady." Elizabeth stepped in front of her daughter and nodded politely. "I am Elizabeth Billingsley. These are my children." "And where is your husband, madame? I must speak to him." The widow bit her tongue and refrained from answering immediately. She decided it would be best not to mention her family's history with the Tories. "My husband is dead, Captain." Quite unexpectedly, Basil spit on the ground in front of the captain's horse. He tilted his head toward the large oak tree near the captain's horse. "They hanged him in that tree beside you, Captain, 5 years ago." "Who hanged him?" the captain inquired, surprised. "Some of your friends from South Carolina, Tory bandits out to terrorize innocent folk. Some of them are buried together in the woods out behind our house." He spat again. Basil stared at the man with a poisonous hatred. His emotion compelled him to fetch a pistol and shoot the enemy soldier, but wisdom enabled him to tame his feelings. He said nothing else. He merely stood fast and stared at the officer. Captain Hollingsworth growled. Indeed, how unfortunate for everyone involved. Elizabeth interrupted their exchange. How may I help you, Captain? Captain Hollingsworth surveyed the Billingsley house. I need to inform you that we may have to make use of your home. It is the largest and appears to be the sturdiest residence in the town. Use it for what? Demanded Basil. As a field hospital. The man shifted his weight in the saddle. Before this day is over, we may have very well need every home in the township in order to care for our wounded, but we shall start with yours. And we have no say in the matter? Elizabeth asked incredulously. No, madam, you do not. This is a matter of service to the crown. Your obedience is expected. We will also require that you assist in rendering care. Elizabeth objected. We know nothing of such things, Captain. I will not have my children exposed to any more blood or violence. The captain leaned forward in his saddle. Mrs. Billingsley, if you refuse, we will simply remove you from the home. Do you understand? Elizabeth did not know what to say. She covered her mouth with her hand, too shocked to speak. Oh, we understand just fine, Basil hissed. Very well, then. I shall inform our surgeons to occupy your residence immediately. Good day to you all. Once again, the man tipped his hat. No one responded to him, so he turned and guided his horse toward the north. He and his men departed the township in a matter of seconds. Martha tapped her mother on the shoulder. What do we do now, Mother? We do as they say, Martha. What choice do we have? 2 hours later. Elizabeth shouted, Hold his leg tightly. Do not let go. Basil strengthened his grip on the right leg of the wounded redcoat. The man screamed and writhed in pain as he lay on the Billingsley family dining room. The cannons continued to rumble at a frightening, deafening pace. Dust and plaster rained down far from overhead, dislodged from the structure of the house by the repeated concussions. The battle had been raging for almost an hour. It took only a scant few minutes after the first explosions of musket fire began for the first wounded soldiers to begin trickling in. As the pace of the fighting increased, so too did the flow of the wounded. For the time being, they were all British soldiers, but Basil was certain that there would be American patriots amongst them before the day was gone. Basil was tired. He took a deep breath as he glanced at the carnage and confusion inside his home. At least 24 men lay on the floors throughout the first floor. Several others, treated within the first hour, had been evacuated to the barn. The more critical patients were upstairs in the Billingsley family's beds. The British soldier gave a sudden, strong, unexpected jerk. Once again, his leg popped free from Basil's grip. Hold him steady now, barked the doctor. Basil complied. The physician quickly continued to probe the muscle of the man's thigh with a strange, silver-colored instrument. Every time he moved the device, the young man wailed louder. Martha, bring that basin over here, and those extra bandages, now! Elizabeth lay across the man's chest, using her body weight to restrain his arms. She quickly wiped her hair away from her face. The coating of blood on her hand colored her forehead with a dark streak of crimson. She was growing weary from holding the man, and she was losing her patience with the pitifully inept surgeon. Elizabeth spoke bitingly. What else do you need, doctor? The surgeon growled in disgust and tossed the metal probe into a blood-stained bowl. He exhaled and then grumbled. Get me my saw. Your saw? Elizabeth exclaimed. Not again, Dr. Peterson. His wound does not even appear to be that deep. Elizabeth's challenging of his decision greatly displeased him. Mrs. Billingsley, I cannot find the lead. It is lodged behind the bone. There are other men, more seriously wounded men, who require my attention. We must remove the leg and move on to the next patient. I will find the musket ball, Elizabeth declared. What? Exclaimed the surgeon. I said that I will find the ball. You may go and see to another patient. You most certainly will not. This is my patient, and I am responsible for his care. Elizabeth placed both fists on her hips. And this is my house. This is my table upon which this poor man lies. Those are my sheets and towels and napkins that are soaked in his blood, she growled. At least let me try. The The surgeon wiped his hands on a towel and tossed it into the wounded man's chest. As you wish, Mrs. Billingsley. I shall return in a short while after you have failed in your foolish endeavor and finished this job. He spun on his heels and stomped across the room. Basil, still clutching the man's leg, stared at his mother with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. What now, Mother? Elizabeth turned and examined the man's wound. Basil, go and fetch the 2 large candelabras from upstairs, along with that tall side table from my bedchamber. I want as much light as I can get. Yes, Mother. And find us 2 helpers from somewhere. I need grown men who can hold this fellow down. Yes, Mother. And tell Martha to bring that jug of rum from the pantry. Yes, Mother. Basil stood and stared at his mother, waiting for her next command. Basil shot an irritated glance at her son. Well, what are you waiting for? I thought you were going to say something else, Mother. Off with you, boy, and quickly. Basil chuckled at his mother, quickly darted across the dining room, and then bounded up the staircase. 1 hour later. I simply cannot believe it, Mother. You did it. Basil shook his head in admiration. He stared at the huge chunk of bloody lead in his hand. It was a flattened, round ball, freshly retrieved from the soldier's thigh. Basil, Elizabeth, and Martha were sitting on the back porch, resting their aching backs and weary heads against the cool brick wall. Little Anna slept peacefully in Martha's lap. All the family members were exhausted from almost 3 hours of nonstop care of wounded British soldiers. Since the fighting had moved further west, there had been something of a lull in the arrival of the wounded. They took advantage of the slowdown as an opportunity for a brief rest break. You saved that man's leg, Mother, Martha exclaimed. Snuggling tightly against her mother's arm, I am so very proud of you. Another rumble of nearby cannons caused the ground beneath the house to tremble. Leaves fell from some of the trees in the yard. A large plank suddenly dislodged and fell from the side of the barn. Elizabeth shook her head in disgust. A lot of good it will do him. He and the countless other boys will surely die either on the horrible battlefield or on another. Basil grunted spitefully. Do not feel too much pity for them, Mother. Remember, they are our enemies. You have sons out there where those cannon balls are falling. A tear welled in Elizabeth's eye. As well I know, Basil. I have thought of nothing but James and John and Samuel since this ghastly fighting began. I pray that they all are safe. And Walter, too, added Martha. We must pray that he is safe wherever he might be. Basil shook his head slowly. He stared blankly into the thick woods behind their house. I fear that Walter is likely on one of those death ships in Charlestown Harbor. God forbid, exclaimed Elizabeth. I cannot bear the thought of it all. She began to sob. I'm sorry, Mother. I did not mean to make you cry. He reached for her hand and took it in his. She squeezed his hand gently. You did not make me cry, Basil. It is this horrible, terrible, frustrating war. I just want it to be done and for all my sons to come home. The back door suddenly opened and a boot heel scraped across the rough wood floor at the far end of the porch. Dr. Peterson, the arrogant British surgeon, stood inside the threshold of the back door. He was wiping his bloody hands with a wet cloth. He had long since shed his wool topcoat. His previously spotless white linen waistcoat and breeches were covered with bloodstains. Please pardon the interruption, but we have a wagon out front, Mrs. Billingsley, full of wounded. I require your assistance forthwith. Yes, Dr. Peterson, we will be right along. The doctor nodded respectfully and then turned and marched back into the house. Just as the door closed behind him, Oliver came running from behind the barn. Basil, you must come and see. Come and see what, Oliver? Oliver Jenkins, where on earth have you been? Elizabeth demanded. I was up in the loft watching the battle off to the west. They moved on a bit now. There are a powerful lot of men laying all over the ground in Mr. Sutton's field, along that fence that runs near the road. Redcoats? Asked Basil. A few, but not many. Mostly other men in ordinary clothes. Basil glanced quickly at his mother. Militia! He hissed. Is anyone tending to them? She asked Oliver. Are there medics or surgeons? No, ma'am. They are all just lying there. I did not see anything moving in the field. Elizabeth nodded to her son. Go, Basil, and take a look. Help anyone that you can. Take Oliver with you, but stay out of sight of the redcoats. Yes, Mother. Come on, Oliver. Basil rose to his feet, and both boys sprinted into the tree line that led toward the battlefield. The two boys knelt beside another fallen Patriot militiaman near the wooden fence. Basil checked for breathing, but there was none. Like all of the others that they had already examined, the poor man was dead. Basil, this is horrible, wailed Oliver. I have not seen anything like it. No one is alive. Swollen teardrops inched down both of his dirt-stained cheeks. We have to keep looking, Oliver. There is still hope. He nodded toward the trees that were 50 yards to their west. Let's check those woods. Oliver nodded. Both boys darted toward the trees. They heard the rumble of cannons from behind them and listened to the terrifying howl of the cannonballs as they soared over their heads. The boys dropped to the ground and covered their heads. Moments later, the balls exploded against the ground far to the west. Was that very close? Oliver asked with a trembling voice. Basil shook his head. No, Oliver. I think it was very far off. We are safe, I think, unless the Patriots break through the lines and push the British back. Let us be quick and see if we can help anyone. The boys rose and pushed onward toward the woods as they neared the trees. They saw that the timber had been decimated by cannon fire. Many of the tree trunks were shattered by explosions. Broken limbs, shards of woods, and fallen timbers lay haphazardly upon the ground. I see wounded men, Basil exclaimed, pointing to the right. They ran in the direction of several fallen soldiers. Suddenly, Oliver stopped running and began screaming in a piercing, frantic voice. He instantly dropped to his hands and knees. His back and chest heaved as he threw up his dinner onto the leaf-strewn ground. Basil fought the urge to vomit as well. Nearby lay a man who had received a full force of a cannonball. His body had been decimated by the explosion. Somehow, Basil managed to keep his wits about him. He turned away from the ghastly sight of the dismembered man and looked at another poor fellow who lay sprawled face down against the base of a tree. Basil gripped the man's shoulders and flipped him onto his back. The wounded man gave a slight groan. This one is alive, Oliver. He's alive. Come and help me. Oliver climbed onto unsteady feet and stumbled toward Basil. He knelt down on the other side of the motionless man. What's wrong with him? Oliver stammered. Basil pointed to his legs. His breeches were torn and bloody. It looks like he has some metal pieces in his legs. He leaned over and listened to the fellow's heart. His heartbeat and breathing are strong. I think he will be all right. His head is a bit bloody, though. Basil reached up and brushed the fellow's long, stringy hair away from his blood-crusted forehead. He gave a sudden gasp and then exclaimed, Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh, thank God! Tears began to flow down his cheeks. Oliver gripped Basil's arm. What is it, Basil? What is wrong? Basil locked eyes with the young boy. His face was covered with tears, but a huge smile consumed his entire face. Oliver, nothing is wrong. This is my brother. This is Walter, the one who was in prison in South Carolina. He is alive.